Welcome back, everyone. Today we are going to be taking a look at some games that were played between the Hikaru bot from chess.com and the Magnus bot at maximum level from the Play Magnus app. Now, in human matchups, we know that Magnus has done very well against Hikaru, but what about a matchup between their bots? So in the first game, Hikaru bot has the white pieces. The game starts with b3, a very typical opening setup. We get b3, b6, bishop to b2, e6, e3, bishop b7, knight f3, knight to f6, and now Hikaru bot plays g3. Now I'm pretty sure that in terms of the Hikaru bot on chess.com, probably there is some opening book and it's based off of games that I've played online in Blitz. So this looks very standard from me. Now I have played this g3 move multiple times, and the reason is very simple. Normally what you would do with the light square bishop here is you'd play something like bishop e2 and castles followed by c4, or you'd play something like d4 followed by bishop d3. However, the reason that I sometimes play g3 is very simple. After d4, d5, let's just say bishop d3, bishop d6, castles, we have a symmetrical pawn structure here. The pawns are mirroring each other, and generally it's very hard to create a big imbalance. So therefore, I like to play this g3 move because it looks a little bit funky. First of all, it opens up this diagonal. It's kind of weird to play e3 to develop the bishop along this diagonal and then fianchetto it by going bishop g2. At any rate, it's something I like to do. So we get g3, bishop e7 played here. Now for those of you who are watching, you're probably wondering, well, can't black go g6 here? And the answer to that is very straightforward. Yes, black can play g6 and simply play copycat chess here with bishop g2 and bishop g7, but for whatever reason, most people do not do that. So we get bishop to e7, we get bishop g2, castles, again, pretty standard so far. We get c5, c4, and now we get this move d6. Now in this position, it's a very rich opening setup. There are many options for both sides. Black can play knight c6. He can also play d5. However, this idea of d6 is to play what we call the Sonic, the hedgehog setup, with d6, knight bd7, and then an a6 later on. And you get all these pawns on the fourth rank. We get d6, knight to c3, knight bd7. d4 is played here by the Hikaru bot, and now we get this very interesting move, knight e4. Now the reasoning behind knight e4 is quite straightforward. If you look at this position, you'll notice that the bishops are opposing each other on g2 and b7. However, on first glance, it does look like this bishop on b2 is a little bit better placed than the bishop on e7, and there are more threats on this long diagonal. So by going knight e4, first of all, you try to trade off a set of knights, but additionally, you want to put this bishop on f6. That way, you will have bishops opposing each other on this diagonal as well as the light square diagonal. So very normal, knight e4, we get trade, we get knight to e1. Now, honestly, if I was playing this position with the white pieces, most likely I would play something like queen to e2, followed by rook to d1, rook to d2, and double stacking on the d file. Knight e1, I guess, is playable, but I'm not super in love with it because you're just trading down even more pieces. So you get trade, pawn takes pawn, you get pawn takes. White could try to take with the queen, I suppose, but after a move like bishop to f6, queen to d2, bishop takes b2, queen takes b2, queen c7, position should be pretty balanced. Like I alluded to earlier, at some point we're going to get something like rook d1, rook d8, something like rook c1, knight f6, maybe knight e1, rook c8, knight f3, and a6. And once again, we have the classic Sonic the Hedgehog setup here with these four pawns on the sixth rank. But black is very solid, even though it looks like these pawns might become a little weak down the road. So Hikaru bot obviously has a mind of its own, so it plays pawn takes pawn. We get pawn to d5 being played here, and now we get this move knight e3. Now once again, Hikaru bot probably stronger than I actually am, but on first glance, if I were playing this position, I almost certainly would trade the pawns here and play something like knight e3, knight f6, and either queen to f3 or queen to d3 with the idea of playing knight f5, and then maybe even going rook c1 and double stacking on the c file. So it's very interesting that Hikaru bot plays knight e3 instead, because now after knight to f6, the problem is that if white ever trades on d5, black does not have to capture back with the pawn. Black can now capture with the knight, and we have what is called the isolated pawn here on d4, which is blockaded by the knight, and black should be a little bit better. So f3 is played here, and the other reason, by the way, that I don't like this is because normally in this setup, if white cannot try to trade the pawns on d5, the only other major idea to go for is something like rook c1, and let's just say I play h6, where you can get something like c5, rook c8, and b4, and you get this passed c pawn, which is protected here, and this can be quite dangerous for black to play. In this specific position, it's probably not much, but really in this pawn structure, there are only two ideas that you have, which is to either try to play c5 or to trade. But as I said before, you can't really trade on d5 because then you have the isolated pawn, and it's also worth noting that you have this bishop on b2 behind this pawn, which is just not doing a whole lot, so black would be better. So we get f3 played here. Now this is an interesting move. I certainly would not play it. In fact, I struggle to understand what the logic is behind the move at all, because to me it seems like just a weakening move. You basically push a pawn to stop knight e4, I guess, although honestly knight to e4 doesn't feel like a big threat. So if I were playing here, I'd probably play queen d3 and then rook c1, rook d1, or rook c1, rook c2, and then rook fc1 to double stack on the c file, preparing to open up the file with c takes d5 down the road. So it's interesting that f3 is played, also because there's a famous maxim, and I'm sure many people have said this, but one player in particular said it many times during various events I've played in, which is Levon Aronian. And he said that, you know, when you push a pawn forward, you can never push the pawn back. So you have to be very careful when you just push pawns and create weaknesses. So f3 is played. We get a5 being played here by Magnus. Again, I don't really know if there's a straightforward reasoning behind it, but what it does do is it always makes it harder for white to get a3, b4, and c5 here to create a pawn chain as well as a protected passed pawn. We get queen to e2. a4 is played by Magnus. We get king h1, and already, much like many of the games where Hikaru has played non-standard, non-theoretical lines, it feels like Magnus, just like Magnus the player, has gotten exactly the position that you want here. We get queen to d7, bishop to c3, rook f c8. Already it feels like Hikaru is just wandering every which way. We get rook ac1. You get h5. Now this move is also kind of interesting. Again, this is probably a computer move versus a human move. Probably if I were playing, I would play something like h6. I suspect Magnus would too, but computers, as we know, they love to push Harry the h pawn and just push h5 h4 or h4 h5 with white. But as we also like to say, it's typical to that classic the classic line you see in commercials where they say, you know, it's a professional actor, do not attempt the stunt at home. And as I would say in chess, you like to see how the computers play, but do not try to play like a computer when you're playing at home. We get h5, rook to b1 is played. We get h4 here. Again, very non-standard, but as I said before, computers love these pawn pushes on the edge of the board. We get g takes h4 being played here. We get queen to d6, rook to g1, trying to take advantage of this open g file. Now, white is up a pawn. At the same time, you can't really do a whole lot because you don't have the knight jump. Black can go queen f4, knight h5, and go after this h pawn. If black can put a knight on h5, just conceptually, you never have any threats to win the pawn, because if you push f4, you will hang a pawn, so you can't really push to attack the knight. You can't put the rook on g5 because the bishop covers it. So black's king side is actually very safe with the lone knight protecting the pawn on g7. At any rate, queen f4 is played here, going after the pawn on h4, keeping an eye on the weak pawn on f3, as well as potentially keeping an eye on the pawn on d4 too. So we get knight to g2, queen to c7, knight to e3. Of course, here black is threatening to win the pawn on c4. If you take, you lose the bishop, and if you don't go back, you just lose the pawn. Knight e3. Magnus plays g6, typical Magnus style. Again, as Magnus said himself, be a shark. Now, queen f4 would, of course, probably lead to a draw, but g6 is how you play like a shark. So we get g6, bishop to d2, pawn takes b3, pawn takes b3, and now we get rook to a2. Looking very, very bad for Hikaru. Let's see what it does here. So it goes rook a1, we get rook a8, rook d1. So basically, black now has a double stack on the a file here. There's also the right triangle to h2 as well. This is looking pretty dire. We get rook d8, queen to d3. Now here, if I were playing this, I'd probably be looking to play something like rook b2 and double stack on the 7th rank with like Castle Mania, as we know from the Michelle Carre videos. But Magnus plays rook d8 instead. We get queen to d3, pawn takes pawn, knight takes pawn, and now we get bishop to b4. And this looks really, really scary here. Again, I'm not sure if I love this this capture though. With bishop b4, because it feels like white has ideas like knight e5 or rook g6 lurking here. Of course, you cannot play bishop takes b4 because then it's checkmate in Uno with queen takes h2. So we get rook to g2, bishop takes d2, rook g takes d2, rook a8 back, knight to e5, and somehow it feels like the Magnus has misplayed this, because already here with such limited material on the board, only a pair of knights, and limited number of pawns, only 4 pawns and 5 pawns for white, even if one of them is doubled. Very limited pawns, only one set of minor pieces, only really one major open file here. Obviously, C file is an open file too, but it feels like white is kind of surviving. So I wonder if Magnus made a mistake or what exactly did wrong, but it feels like Hikaru has survived. We get knight d7, knight to g4 is played, queen to f4, queen to e4. We get queen takes queen. Now black could not take the rook with the queen. After rook takes queen, rook takes rook, this would hang the rook on a8 in the corner. We get queen takes e4, f takes e4, and already I think at this point it's very clear that Hikaru has equalized. It has survived. the danger, and I assume that this probably should end in a draw here. We got f5, e takes f5, g takes f5, we got knight to e3, knight f6, and we get knight c4. Now, if I were playing here, I probably would try to play something like d5. Now, d5 here might be a blunder because of f4 attacking the knight, and if you move the knight, black takes the pawn with the knight on f6. So maybe you can't play d5 right away, but nonetheless, you can also play a move like knight c4 to create the classic bastion with this great knight posted on d5. You get b5, rook takes rook, rook takes rook, knight to d6. Interesting, not knight e5, which is probably the move I would have played just to stop knight g4. After knight d6, you really worry about knight g4 because now there's a fork with knight f2. h2 is weak as well, so it looks quite scary, but as we know, computers, they don't really become afraid of anything. We go rook e1, knight takes h2, going for the classic Arabian checkmate with the stallion and the tower. If white plays rook takes e6, there's knight to f3. Let's just say you play a move like rook e3, there's rook h2 checkmate. And if you play rook g6, king h7, rook g2 to stop the mate, it's still an Arabian checkmate with rook a1, rook g1, and rook takes rook. So I don't know the reason that we call this the Arabian checkmate. If you have a knight and a rook like this, or the other one, or the other one with the rook on h2, for whatever reason, this is what we call the Arabian checkmate. So after knight takes h2, we get rook g1 check, knight to g4 back, rook to e1, knight f2. Now, it's worth noting this is the same position, except you simply don't have a pawn on h2. Knight f2 is played, king g1, knight to h3, king h1, knight to f4, trying to guard this pawn on e6. We get d5 here, and this is a very, very critical move here, because in an endgame, let's just say white were to take on b5, after a move like rook d2, white probably can still save the game, but in all these endgames, black has two connected pawns if knights ever come off the board, so this could be winning. Whereas white, for example, all the pawns are spread out. You have all these, what we call pawn islands. You have 1, 2, 3 pawn islands here. So if you're not able to simplify the position immediately, you could lose in a long endgame. So we get d5 here, black takes, white takes the pawn at f5, and now as you'll notice, material is even, but the pawns are split. They're no longer connected, and the rest should be pretty straightforward. We got rook d2, rook f1, knight d3, rook g1, king f7, rook g2, check, king h2, knight e5, check, king a6, knight takes b5, d4. Somehow I feel like Hikaru bot has messed this up. If I go back to this position, just right here, maybe I'm crazy, but I think you can check, and maybe no, you can't take the pawn because there's knight f2 check. King g1 loses to knight h3, and or maybe this might also still be a draw because takes, you can go rook f3, trap the knight here, and after check, king g2, knight g1, I assume you can go rook g3 check, and then king f2, and the pony is trapped here. There are no squares for the knight, so this would have been a little bit cleaner probably, but it doesn't happen. Instead, we get this position here, which actually, to be honest, looks kind of scary. This pawn is coming down the board really fast. The knight is optimally placed to support the pawn push. Rook as well is perfectly placed, so knight supports d3. It also will later support d2 with the knight f3 check, so it looks kind of scary. But as I said before, computers, if a position is a draw, it will find any number of draws. Doesn't even matter if it looks scary to us humans. It will do whatever it considers to be the most precise. We get king g3, king d5, knight c7, king c6, knight e6, king d6, knight to g5, rook h1. I don't know why d3 wasn't played here, but rook h1 is played. We get rook a2, d3, knight to e4, king e6, rook a4, which I guess actually makes sense. You guard the knight on e4. Maybe you can bring the king close, but once again, I don't think it really changes the objective evaluation. We get king to d5, knight c3, king e6, rook d4. Again, knight e4 would lead to a draw. Rook d4, rook g1, king f2, rook c1, knight d5, rook c2, king e3. Once again, insane to play like this for us humans. Obviously, if I had this position, I would just go knight e4 and make the draw, but computers, they'll still find the perfect moves. We get knight g6 here. Now d2 looks scary on first glance, but I think here you can play knight to c3 going after the rook, and if the rook moves to say h2, you simply go king to g3 attacking the rook, and the rook has no squares on the second rank. And after, I guess, rook g2, just simply king e3 here, and you go after the pawn, and this should be a straightforward draw. So we get knight to g6, king g3, d2 is played. Now knight f4, knight takes, king takes, and we've reached a drawn rook and pawn endgame. We get rook h2, king to g3. Now it's worth noting if white goes king e3, black does have to be a little bit precise. Well, I guess not really precise, but the one issue is, let's just say you get some position like this, for example, just to illustrate the point. Get a position like this, technically this is still a draw, but the king is cut off on e5, so white could win this rook and pawn endgame. Of course, after king to e3, black can simply go check, king takes d2, rook takes b3, run the king over, stop the pawn, and it's also just a very basic draw. We get king g3, king e5, rook d8, rook e2, king f3, rook h2, king e3, rook takes h4, king takes d2, and now we get rook d4 check, forcing the king and pawn endgame. But this is obviously just a draw because the black king will be in front of the pawn. White cannot get his king in front. Worth noting, if black were to play a move like rook h5, however, after king to c3, this would be, I believe, a technically winning rook and pawn versus rook endgame, because the king is cut off and white can push the pawn up the board. We get rook d4 trade, king c2, king d5, king d3, king c5, king c3, and the rest I think is pretty basic. Obviously, Magnus bot, it's 3,000. It's not going to make any blunders, and the game does end in a draw, I believe. Here we go, and finally the game ends in a draw here after king b5, king b8. So the first game between Hikaru bot and Magnus bot ends in a draw. I do hope you guys have enjoyed this video. We're doing a couple of videos of Hikaru bot versus Magnus bot games, but this is the first video we have, so if you guys have not hit that subscribe button below, make sure to hit that subscribe button, and we will have a second video with the second game that will be going up pretty soon as well. See you guys soon.